Welcome to VCR, a Vintage Cinema Rewind. We're bringing old movies to new viewers. I'm Blake.
I'm Jason.
And in a way, aren't we as podcasters pod people?
I think we are, yeah. And we're trying to show everyone else the way of the pod.
Yeah, I want you to watch this movie and become a pod person like us because it is sick.
And it's infectious.
Yeah. And honestly, at this point in time, what I'll say too is we're watching Invasion of the Body Snatchers 1978 this week. This is the spoiler full discussion. So actually, technically, you already are a pod person. Welcome to the podhood.
Yes.
If you aren't part of the bod crew, the bod crew, then go back and watch or listen to the last episode where we talk spoiler-free, do our spoiler-free discussion of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Really great movie. Just pure paranoia, anxiety type of sci-fi horror. Some of my favorite. In there with The Thing and It Follows and all of those other Alien, all of those other kind of horror movies that I would be on my Mount Rushmore. Really recommend this one. So please don't let us spoil this for you. Go check out that last episode.
Yeah. What I love about this too is like I'm not super into like Halloween-y scary movies, so this is like way more up my alley for Halloween as like a Halloween movie.
It's not a slasher film.
Yeah,
It's a, part body horror, part paranoia, part allegory to capitalism, you name it, basically. Like, I think everyone watching this film is going to come away taking away something a little different from it, which is really cool.
Yeah.
And still just ever present, like, the themes of the film itself are really something that holds up well to the passage of time.
Yeah, like anybody can watch this on a Saturday night and be scared.
Yeah, 100%. So, that being said, this is our spoiler-full discussion, and we're just going to dive right into it, starting in front of the camera and working our way back. Where I want to start is, obviously, in the last episode, we talked about, how cool, sci-fi, low-budgety kind of the opening credits are.
Yeah.
We move from there into our San Francisco setting where the film takes place in. The meaty flowers, like the pods, the meat flowers, they're so gross right from the get-go, like instantly like repelled from them.
Mm-hmm. This opening credits are like another alien world, but then it's they've traveled to Earth and it's raining. The water droplets all over the plants are growing these weird rooty spores.
Yes.
Even those, like, as soon as I was like, it got me into it. I was like, what the hell are those? Like, for me, I was like, how did they film that back then? What did they do?
It would have been stop motion is my guess, but
yeah, that's what I was thinking.
It's very well done.
Yeah, super well done. And starts the questioning. It it immediately starts you questioning, like, oh, how's this gonna go down?
Yeah, and it also, in a way, it covertly sets your expectations of where this story is starting. And I want to talk about that a little bit later into this discussion, but it feels like when we start this movie off, we're at the start of the invasion.
Yeah.
But that's not necessarily true, which is
exactly
maybe one of the coolest parts of this entire movie.
Yeah. Like, obviously, we see a little bit of the beginning, but you don't know when the first person was infected.
Yes.
Was snatched.
Yeah, exactly. And I want to talk about that, but I want to save that a little bit later into our discussion because I think there's one part in time when my mind started thinking about that. So I want to come to that point in time like I'm organically watching this film. So in the first opening scene where Elizabeth Driscoll notices that weird flower, there's right from the get-go, like everything is just off-putting about like what's happening because we hear this squeaky, like, we're in this play equipment, we hear this squeaky swing going, and then it pans over and there's like this priest on a swing staring at her, and I'm like, oh my god, that's Robert Duvall.
Yeah. I was like I didn't know he was in this.
No, neither did I. And it's just like a brief little cameo, but it's just like instantly throws you off.
Yeah, and like the filming from the camera, like the camera was on the swing and it just instantly gets you into that, like it's squeaky and creaky and it's moving all weird. So it's like instantly like the camera work just throws you off. And then you get these like her with these little flowers.
And she takes them home and then we see her exploring the idea of what these flowers mean, what they represent, all of that with her husband.
We get the idea that she's like quite good at biology. Like it might have something to do with her work. She does like research and does testing on things like that. Yeah, she goes into it thinking that it's like when two species cross-pollinate and create a third species. So she's kind of like interested and excited. She's like, oh, I found something very rare.
Yeah, and then it happens that she ends up like just putting it on the nightstand, but it's on her husband's side, not her side, which is really important because...
Did she? I thought she put it in a jar and then...
She did.
And then later it was just in her husband's water glass.
Oh, did it? I wasn't sure.
I don't know how it got there.
I'll have to rewatch. It's such a small detail, but it just ends up on the table, bedside, beside them. And then, we wake up next day and her husband's already out of bed. The flower's gone and he's cleaning something up, putting it in the dustpan. And he literally goes out to the garbage and throws it in the garbage. All of it's weird. Like everything about it is just wrong.
Yeah. And also like just on the background of her husband, he was already a little bit cold to her. Like he was watching TV with headphones, which I didn't even know they could do that back in the 70s.
True.
And like, but he does greet her very warmly when she comes in first. And then she starts telling him about all this. And he's like, yeah, whatever. I'm trying to watch the game. And like, so there's this coldness there. And then you still see such a change in him in the next morning. And she like instantly feels it.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's so much background themes, like even just the theme of two people growing apart is actually like a little sub theme that I was thinking about in this as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
And how as a married couple, you could potentially grow apart like this, but it's just like the suddenness of it that's so jarring in this case. Yeah, so then there's the connection with Matthew, who works also for the health department. He's like a health and safety inspector, which is a really cool setup. Like, I don't think we've ever seen, or I can't think of another movie where the hero is the health inspector, the hated guy of most films, right?
It's the opposite of Ratatouille.
Yeah, exactly. It's so unique. Like it's kind of cool because on one hand, it feels like you shouldn't like Matthew Bennell as a character because of who he is and what he represents, basically, right? But at the same time, like he's somewhat likable pretty instantly because even though he's really passionate about catching these guys, it also somewhat feels like he's just kind of going through the motions as well. Like he's good at his job, but he just like doesn't care necessarily.
He's like burnt out because he goes to the restaurant that he's trying to get brought up on, trying to get it shut down because he finds a rat turd in their soup. And then they smash his windshield with a cheap bottle of wine.
Right. Actually, that's one of my favorite things about this film, and again, it's just that underlying sense of wrongness is the broken windshield is something that's ever present in the film. It's a constant of the film. He never gets it fixed, and he's always driving around with it. It shatters the perception of the front of the
and you can't quite see the whole picture.
Yeah,
kind of idea.
Also, and even while they're driving around in a more literal sense as well, you can't actually see all of the weird stuff going on because this movie does a really good job of framing these wide shots of public spaces, big public spaces, and there's always at least one person who's just kind of standing there where you're like, that just doesn't seem right, logical.
Yeah, it's a big city and there's so many people walking around and you're like, is this just regular footage or and then you see someone just kind of confused or just standing there staring and
looking kind of sinister,
and it starts making you ask questions.
Yeah, exactly, along with the main characters, right? And so that's when Elizabeth is trying to figure out what's going on, and she's confiding in Matthew because it doesn't feel like she has a whole lot of other people in her life to confide to at this point. So they're trying to get to it together, figure it out. Matthew's pretty open to the idea of something strange is going on. And that I think speaks to, again, like you were saying in the previous episode, the fact that Elizabeth and Matthew have a very work spouse relationship. They're very connected to each other.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really important because he does like basically say, you know, like, I believe you, something weird is happening. So maybe let's go talk to my friend who's a psychiatrist. And so on our way to the party to go meet him is when the crazy scientist guy from Piranha, what's his name? Kevin McCarthy makes his appearance. I will say, I rewatched that scene actually this afternoon, and on rewatch, there's actually one of the screams of one of the pod people that you can hear.
Oh, no way.
Yeah. You know, again, what I'll say about this film is that there's so much going on in the background that you're not going to like notice things on first viewing. And so this is a film that becomes so much more rewatchable because of that.
It's very layered.
Yeah, it's a very layered film. And so when he's chasing them, you know, or when he goes up to their car and he's smashing the windshield and he's like, oh, like, you got to run away. Like, they're coming. They're here already. They're going to get you. And then he runs away because, you know, there's a massive amount of people kind of almost chasing him.
Yeah.
Again, in retrospect, hearing that scream that's in the background, the cry of the pod people, they are chasing him down. They're hunting him.
Yeah. And we just like the characters are like, what? I wonder what he did.
Yeah. And then he gets hit by a car too, right? And these people who are just, there's a lot of apathy in this world too, right? Like they hear him get hit because they're around the corner when he runs away, and then they drive by him and he's dead on the street. And there's all these people kind of surrounding him, watching him. And they're just like, rather than stopping and seeing if he's okay, they're like, oh, the police will come and like take care of this kind of thing.
Yeah.
It's just kind of, you know, they see this horrible thing happen. It's pretty traumatic. Like, if that happened to me, like, that would be like a core memory burnt into the back of my mind kind of thing, right?
When you see the crowd standing around, you're like, why are they so apathetic? Are they just in shock? Like, they can't all be. Like, it's just making you like, what is going on?
Yeah, it's so unnerving. Like, it's really well done. And then so we get to the party, and this is where we kind of meet all of the other kind of secondary characters, where we meet Jeff Goldblum's character, Jack, where we meet Leonard Nimoy as David Kibner at this big party. And even this scene is just like so unnerving. Yeah. Like, it's gross without there being any bit of grossness to it.
Elizabeth is already like so paranoid, and then you see it mirrored in that random other lady who's like freaking out, trying to tell the doctor that like it's not her husband that came with her. And so automatically Elizabeth is like, what's going on? Like, she's going to find out kind of because she's experiencing that too. And then the whole time Matthew is on the phone with trying to tell the police what happened, and they don't have like a record of it or something.
Right. Like, it's so, that whole scene is really wild, right? Because, you know, we're at Dr. Kibner's like book opening party kind of thing. You know, he's kind of like a self-help guru, it feels like. And so everybody's there for him, and there's, you know, this paranoia of this woman, like, outwardly, like, something's not right. My husband isn't who he says he is. And then Elizabeth, like, on the side being like, I believe you. I know that what you're saying isn't a lie because I feel it as well. You've got Jeff Goldblum's character, Jack, is, you know, he's jaded with the whole thing in general. Like, he's kind of anti-establishment kind of guy. Like, you know, he's wearing the old Vietnam style jacket, and he's talking over Matthew. Matthew's on the phone. He's like really trying to get the police to listen, and Jack is just like, oh, hang that up. Don't talk to the police. Don't tell them your name. And like, that is adding all this extra stress too. Like, you're watching two super stressful scenes happen, like, merge together. All the while, like, the camera just kind of, you know, slowly like moving around the room,
and it's packed.
And you don't know who to trust. Like, all these people, like, everybody just seems like so strange. Like, when you're looking for something, when the conspiracy begins and you get sucked into this conspiracy, you just see like shadows everywhere, basically, right?
Yeah. And you're looking around in this crowd, and like the one, like, you see two people talking, but like they have no emotion, and you're like, is it just that kind of party? Like, is that person weird? Am I weird for noticing it?
Yeah, exactly. Like, there's just so much like going on, and so much that just doesn't quite add up, right? And this is where, things really come to a head in, right after this scene where we get out of the party and Matthew convinces Dr. Kibner to have a conversation with Elizabeth about all of this. Mm-hmm. And this is really when I was starting to get almost like frustrated with things, because I was like, Kibner is almost like downplaying what's happening with Elizabeth. And he's saying, oh, all these people are coming to me and saying all this stuff. But like,
he's going with like the misogynistic, like it's a bunch of women who want to leave unhappy relationships that are coming to me saying my husband has changed overnight. And it's like, it's just hysteria. Calm down. Go see your husband. Like everything's okay. Just go to sleep.
I was so frustrated at this moment because I was like, why is Dr. Kibner not listening? Like, why is Dr. Kibner not even like entertaining the idea that things are wrong? I was like, he must see the fact that people are acting weird, right? For someone as a psychiatrist. So I actually wrote down while I was watching the movie, is this a plot hole? Like, is this just like, something that doesn't make sense with the character that's just going to like annoy me for the rest of the movie now? Yeah. And the answer to that is hardest of no's. Like, even the film has convinced me that Kibner is like not a pod person yet.
Yeah.
And that is the glory. This is right here, right then, like 5 minutes after this, where my brain starts to go, wait a second. Are we a lot further into the invasion than we were let on to believe in the opening sequences of this film?
Yeah.
And that is the core. That is the core of this movie that makes it so goddamn good, is the fact that when it slowly starts to make you realize that, no, the invasion's already happened.
Mm-hmm.
The further and further we get into this film, you realize that the war has already been fought and won.
Yeah.
And we're just so unprepared as the main cast and like crew of this film to deal with what's happening. Like, we've got a health inspector and a biochemist. Like, that's our best like help here.
Yeah. And they're trying to get a psychologist, and then they just have an author friend and a mud spa person.
Yeah, and like right off the bat, you start to think about things that have happened already, like, the dump trucks, like the garbage trucks, and them picking stuff up and not finding that weird at all, like the opening sequence.
Did you see
how present that is?
Yeah. When did you start noticing, like, I kept questioning, like, what is in the back of that garbage truck?
Yes, all the hair and stuff.
Yeah.
That actually completely coincides with my thoughts on, like, this is actually much bigger than anybody realizes yet. Yeah. And that is when I think they're outside still. I think this is in the same point of the movie, and there's like a big garbage pail right behind Matthew, and it's full of hair.
Yeah.
I was like, is that just like all that's left of the humans after? I was like, what has happened? Like, how are they transforming into these pod people, right?
Yeah. At this point, I was also questioning, like, are the main characters just immune? Is it that type of movie? Like, is one of them going to be immune, and they're going to, like, they have an immunologist type researcher, and they're going to figure it out? Yeah, they're just questions on questions.
Yeah, it's so many questions. Again, I started to feel the vibe of this movie, and I was like, if things are as bad as I'm starting to think they are, I don't know how the main characters can ever be victorious in this movie.
Yeah.
And that's just something that, like, it kind of started to settle into me. And then, the movie starts progressively getting, more and more paranoid as we go, like, and things just keep changing and become more apparent. Like, we stop hearing like the birds chirping or the outside noises and then there's a period in time in the film where we hear a lot of sirens. There's a lot of like a lot of stuff happening, and then as we get later and later in the film, things get quieter. And there's less of the sirens, there's less of like the city life noises that you hear kind of thing. Everything starts to get calmed down a little bit. And there's a great quote as well, because eventually, like, when Matthew really is in on the conspiracy, he starts calling all of these connections that he has through the health department, and people are saying to him, yeah, we'll take care of it. Or like, there's people who are downright like, like, I have more important things to deal with right now.
Or we've heard this story before. Don't tell anybody else. Like, don't like cause a panic.
Yeah, very conspiracy heavy, like, messaging from people. There's even a point in time where somebody says, people are going back to normal. And that's a quote that's really like unsettling too, right?
And so is this okay? So after the party, though, they go to the mud house.
Yes.
And, like, at that point, you're questioning like who's real and who's not. So was that the next day? I think so. He started calling everybody after he saw the body on the table.
I'm getting a little bit ahead of like the mud pit like scene and everything. The mud pit scene is oh, man, that is some of the best like horror ever. Like, it's so well shot, is what I will say. Like, the camera lingering on the door closed in the mudroom with all of the like the drapes kind of around each of the rooms where each person can kind of change and then go into the mud kind of thing. It lingers there, and it kind of like a little bit of wind goes through, and it just sits there, and I'm like, oh, like it's just those little like things that just again make you so scared of everything going on. That's when the first real pod person enters into the movie, like when we first start to see how the process happens, because Jeff Goldblum's character is kind of lying down, he's got a nosebleed, and then there's this body that like shows up beside him in the room beside him, and it's covered in like all this wispy stuff, like it looks like saran wrap almost. And like fuzzy saran wrap. It's just completely wrapped, and then they start investigating it. And that's when they call Matthew over, and so Matthew comes and checks it out, and Matthew realizes pretty quickly too that actually, you know what? It's not even Matthew. It's Nancy, Jeff's wife. She finds it, but she's the one who notices that it kind of, in a way, resembles her husband. And that's where Matthew's like asking him, like, oh, like, how tall are you? How much do you weigh? Kind of thing. And Jeff, like, who's got Jeff Goldblum, has got the bloody nose, and he sees the blood come out of its nose, as well as like Nancy sees its eyes open. Like, everything about it is just so unsettling, right?
And they're just touching it all over, getting their face close. I'm like, don't touch it.
Because we really don't know how people are infected at this point in time, like how this is kind of spread, right? Like that scene kind of, you know, really starts to like set us down. Again, there's right after that, there's another garbage truck. The
body disappears.
There's a whole lot of mystery, like, and I think as well at this point in time, this is when Leonard Nimoy's character, Dr. Kimner, has come back, and every time he's there, things just don't quite add up, right? And that's really, I think it's this scene is really where I started to think like, oh, maybe Kibner's actually in on this as well, kind of thing, right?
And then you see Matthew go off, and he's sent Elizabeth home to her husband, like the doctor said. So he's like, oh shit, something weird is going on, I have to go get her. And then you just see like her husband sitting in front of the TV with the headphones on, and he has to sneak in. And then finding the replica, like how like, much more formed.
It's farther along in the process. It's easier to see that they really are copies, like, and then so he wakes her up and they escape, kind of thing. And then he alerts the police, and by the time he gets back there, again, the body's gone. They've done a really good job of making it almost look like if you were in the dark, if you thought, you know, you saw something in there, that it almost did look human, but it wasn't. Like, there's no longer the pod in there or anything. You know, you're questioning even whether the police are in on it at this point in time. Like, who's in on this, who's not, kind of thing.
Who's just incompetent and ignorant, and who is acting.
And again, there's all the relationship paranoia of like, the police are like, what is happening? Like, you're saying that your wife has gone with this man, and there's probably underlying, like, you know, abuse connections or something like that, like allegories to like spousal abuse and stuff in there.
And her husband is just like, grab some clothes. Like, is she coming home tonight? And Matthew's like, no, she's not. And he's like, why are you acting so weird? And then he's really like, I don't know.
He's not arousing any sort of suspicion in how calm he's acting, right?
And the police aren't picking up on that. And then you see them look at each other, but it's not a super meaningful look. Like the Jack and the police officer look at each other, but it's knowing, but it's not obvious that it's
more subtle.
It's so subtle.
And then so then the whole group, like the four of our main heroes, decide to like camp out together. this is where Matthew goes outside to sleep, to almost like watch guard. And then, this is like one of the grossest scenes in the whole film is we finally see how the pod people are grown, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the grossest scenes of body horror, we literally watch as a full Matthew, as well as the rest of the characters, are birthed out of these meat flowers and grown rapidly. And that's where, like, I was literally yelling at the TV, like, wake up, wake up, wake up.
Yeah.
And the scene goes on almost like, a half minute too long, like longer than your brain can handle.
You see like a weird fetus come out, and then it grows, and it's like gasping, and he's still sleeping, and his eyes are kind of fluttering, and he's twitching a little bit, like you're dreaming. And then it's not fully him, and then like suddenly it's like looking a lot more like him, like it's his face and his hair eventually. And like I was like, how are these ones being done so goddamn quickly? Like this, that's where it's like other ones, it seemed like a very slow infection, but now these aliens are really figuring out how to replicate in like 20 minutes.
Yeah. Well, we don't know how long this has gone on necessarily.
Yeah,
like it could be sped up. And the other part of all this too, right, is something that we've seen earlier is when the characters are starting to be changed, there's all that like wispy hairs on them. At that point, like you start to see like it's framed really well. Like there's the little like piece of skin almost that's like floating in the wind on his face. Like it's all really gross and scary. And he's sleeping, and then Elizabeth, you start to hear Elizabeth yell his name.
No, it was Nancy.
Was it Nancy?
It was Nancy, yeah. Because she wasn't going to sleep. Like she was watching the people inside, kind of. But yeah.
And then so he finally wakes up and sees like around him that everything is growing, right?
Yeah.
And he's literally like yelling at her, like, wake everybody up, like they're getting us while we're sleeping. And so that's like also kind of scary in and of itself, is like the way that they get you is they must have to have a pod around you so that the pod can connect to you and take your DNA. But B, it happens while you're sleeping. It happens when you're completely incapacitated.
Yeah, I think it can happen really slowly if like just a little flower is there. But once there's big pods by you, it can happen super quick. And yeah, like the not sleeping part, like these people have been paranoid for like a few days already. And then now they're like really connecting the dots that we can't sleep. And like sleep deprivation plus all the paranoia, like they go crazy.
It's almost exponential horror at this point. Like as the further and further that we get into this, the more and more like absolutely hopeless it feels. Like, how are these characters going to survive something that requires them to not asleep, basically, right? Like all of it is just really, really good, well-written horror.
So like he falls asleep. I start getting really into the, like I'm zoned the fuck in. I'm not watching over my shoulder for Annabelle anymore. Yeah. That's when she starts creeping down the stairs, and I'm in like a pitch black room and my back is to like the stairs, and she's slowly creeping, and I'm like, oh no, I'm like yelling at the TV. And then he like goes inside, gets everybody, wakes Elizabeth up and everything, and then they start running, and then he's like, I'm going back, like you guys keep running. And then he gets the shovel and and like he just caves in his own face of his replica. Like
it's really great. Like again, I rewatched that scene as well, and like he sits there for a minute and he goes to Elizabeth to kill that, and he's like,
can't do it. It's too much like her.
Yeah, it's like comparable to zombie films, right?
Yeah,
when it's like that person that you've always known your whole life kind of thing.
Yeah,
it's very comparable to that. And then he has to look at himself. He has to literally look down at himself and cave his own face in.
Yeah, and like the way they filmed that, like it was so brutal. Like that, and then like at that point, I'm like swearing at the TV, and then she grabs me from behind, and I like get up, almost hit her. I'm like, fuck you.
Yeah. Oh my god, that would have been literally like nightmare inducing.
Yeah. I had to take a break from watching it for like 5-10 minutes just to calm down.
Were you just like explaining to her like what was happening at that point too? Like you have no idea what you just like stumbled into.
Yeah, and what you like, it was perfect timing to be jump scared in real life, because like I was just so engrossed in the disgusting, like the face smashing and the body growing.
And like that's when like all the pod people show up, and like we hear like formally their scream, like their collective scream, as they first of all they see like one of their own being brutally killed, and then they go after like the humans, right? I've realized at this point that there's too many people that have been infected, and again, it's exponential horror, but it's also like the growth of something like this happening, and this is where I'll tie this back to The Thing, is in The Thing, the scientist does all the calculations, and he's like, oh, there's a 78% chance that one of us is already infected. Yeah. Oh, if this gets to the main world, this is going to like completely like take over humanity within, I don't know, like 100 days or something like that kind of thing. I was sitting there and I was like, and realizing this, and starting to think about like all of the people who are already infected, and I was like, this must be 30 to 50% of the people, like probably 50% or more of people in San Francisco are already infected at this point in time, right?
Yeah, I want to say like 80% or higher. Like it's because earlier we see her following her husband, and he's just passing random things between like groups of people who are they don't meet regularly. She didn't recognize any of them, and they're all just like meeting for like 3 seconds, passing something over, and then they nod and like don't acknowledge each other and just keep walking.
Yeah, it's the rapid pods that they're passing along.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the thing, is like that's really what it hits me at this point, is like I'm thinking back and I'm like, there must have been at least 30% of the population infected in the onset of this movie, because you know, even at Dr. Kimner's party, there's a chunk of people in that point, and like, you know, to think about it, like all of these different people that are all like coming from different walks of life that all have never met before, like to have all of these people infected, there's no way that a large part of the population is not already lost, kind of thing. And that's where
that's where like also the hive mind aspect, we haven't even brought that up. Like I don't think I've watched a full hive mind movie before. This might be my first hive mind concept.
Yeah. Because for sure.
They do have to like meet up and stuff, but they communicate, they understand, like the whole group, they're all on the same page. Everything makes sense. Like they have to organize a little bit in like vocally, like you see the people on like the fog or the speaker, like telling them like, oh, go over here, pick up this. Yeah,
for sure. And so like, that's where, again, understanding where we actually are in the story, it really brings it home that like, that the last part of this movie, I really didn't see there being a happy ending, and I really didn't know where we were going, but I didn't feel good about the last half of this movie.
Yeah, especially because they're running, and they're also like kind of dumb characters in sometimes, and then they're smart characters other times, where like they're running, they're at the pier, and then they see a helicopter, and Jeff Goldblum is like, I'm going to go to the helicopter because it's hopefully only in this city. Like that's one of our only hopes, is that it's localized, and hopefully that's like the Coast Guard or something like that, like coming in to save us. I don't know why I did the Boston thing, but the Coast Guard, like military, is coming in to save us. He had to check, because at this point, I think they understand that it's probably everywhere, but they don't know.
Well, there's so many people chasing them too, right?
Yeah.
And they know at this point that like, that nobody's coming to help them, it feels like, locally. Like the police are in on it, and the garbage people, and like there's just, it seems to have like permeated through the top of San Francisco at this point, and that they're not going to get help from the typical people that they would be getting help from.
Yeah. They can't rely on anyone locally. So like there's still those glimmers of hope that they have, and then they just get smashed.
Yeah. And then we go into like, you know, like the red light district of San Francisco, basically, right? And I thought that was actually a really interesting idea to even explore in this film as well, because we've seen that we know now that going to sleep is what inevitably gets you, basically, because you go to sleep, somebody puts a pod beside you, game over. And we go into the red light district, the 24 hours, like people are awake at night and everything like that, and that kind of feels like maybe the last safe haven of this world.
Yeah, potentially. I didn't think about it that way, but I also felt like they were really trying to get them into a dark room. Like they were setting up traps for anybody who's left. And
yes,
I was also kind of mind blown, like how dedicated they were to actually getting every single person. Like, why do they need every single person? And why are they like so vehemently trying to find our characters?
I think they're just trying to destroy like and consume all of humanity, basically. Like eventually we get a little bit of exposition from Kibner about, you know, they came from this dying world, like that they remove all of the negative emotions
and positive,
basically. And positive, and they've just basically boiled it down to like, we are a species of survival, and that's all life is survival. And so what we do is we travel the universe looking for habitable worlds to take over, control, and survive on, kind of thing. And that's actually a really interesting idea that I was thinking about while I was watching this movie as well, and it kind of explains the reason for the pod people taking over the bodies is, and I'm going to compare this to something like War of the Worlds, like a very classic alien invasion story, is the reason why in War of the Worlds that the aliens are no longer victorious is because our Earth is not habitable for them. And eventually, like, the microbes, the diseases and infections of our world eventually eradicate them. And we've seen that kind of idea explored in other things. You know, like, it's obvious that one species is not going to grow and adapt in the same conditions as another species, and therefore they wouldn't be able to live on the same world necessarily without ways to survive. And so it just seems so obvious that, like, why wouldn't you take over the DNA of something that obviously is so dominant in that world and so, like, easy to live and adapt on that? And this is like a species that has evolved one level over to, they're not even adapting at their, like, in their own environment. They're able to adapt at other environments by taking over and controlling the dominant species of that environment.
Yeah, like, they learned how we adapted.
Exactly.
And they understand it so well.
It's such an intelligent way to frame, like, an alien invasion.
Yeah, and, like, they knew they had to take all the garbage men so they could, like, hide all the fluffy stuff.
And it's all about adapting. Like, and he says it at one point too, like, we are an adaptive species. And that is something that we see throughout the film. And especially as retroactively, as we're thinking about everything that's leading up to every point in time that we've gotten to in the film, like, everything just clicks so well together.
And then what I really love too is Nancy figures out how to walk among them.
Yes.
And we see that multiple times.
And that's something that's explored in, like, other horror, like, especially zombie stuff, right?
Yeah, like The Walking Dead, one of the first season, how they, like, cover themselves and walk like a zombie.
Yeah, there's so many themes and ideas that it kind of does connect to, like, zombie lore. Like, I think if you're a fan of the zombie genre, like, this is kind of adjacent to zombie movies as well.
Yeah, very much so.
But yeah, she knows how to infiltrate them, and that's actually something that's really important to her character as well, right? And her and Jack being on the fringes of society, like, they're not quite in, like, you know, the high society kind of part of San Francisco, is like, she automatically is on board with everything going on. She's automatically like, this must be aliens. Yeah, I believe it. I think it's aliens. I think we're in deep trouble. Like, there's no doubt from her, like, that this doesn't make sense, that this couldn't happen logically.
And her character is actually, like, complex in a certain way, because, like, we see her as she believes really easily, which like makes like you said, she's on the fringe of society kind of, but she's very emotional when in, like, all of the scenes, but she's the one who can walk among them with no emotion. She's like, you just have to lose all emotion in your face, don't react to anything. And she's the sole survivor, really. So as far as we know.
Yeah, for sure. Like, she, even at the part where she's re-met up with them again, Jack's been lost, and actually winding back before that scene is really when Kibner reveals what's going on, and that like, you know, they're from a dying world. I thought like all the exposition was really interesting too, like the fact that they came from a dying world. Like I was sitting there thinking about this, like, because he was like trying to pacify them, like, you know, like everything in an hour, you're not going to care that, you know, you're going to be different, like, because you're going to be the same, you're just not going to have the emotions like anymore, like you're going to be one of us kind of thing. And
like, I think Elizabeth's husband is like, it's painless, don't worry. Like, everybody that you see come back and like they know that the main characters understand what's going on, they're like, man, it's so nice being part of everybody else. Like,
right.
yeah.
And you could still enjoy like all of the material things in your life. Like that's still going to all be there. Like nothing's really changed all that much.
Yeah.
Even though, you know, we've seen, and we still don't know like what happens to the bodies of the people who have.
No, we do. Like the real.
We know eventually
body.
what happens. Yeah, we know eventually. But at this point in time, like when they're trying to convince them, we don't know like how horrific it is to become a pod person.
Yeah, yeah.
Like you're literally, your body is dying and you're being reborn. But like, how much of that do you feel? We'll never know, right? And like the pod people aren't ever going to like admit to the horrifying feeling of your body being sucked dry.
Yeah, and like to the pod person, they're just being born, which as someone who's been born before, you don't remember it, you don't feel it. It was pretty horrific, probably, as like, yeah, it's a horrific process, but to them it was nice and painless.
Yeah. So yeah, Jeff Goldblum's character gets killed, and then like I said, it explains everything. And like at this point too, I was thinking, yeah, these pod people are trying to pacify them and everything, but they're coming from a dying world. Like, is their way of life actually even better than like, are they just gonna suck this world dry and then move on to the next? Like, is that their literal, like, they are consumers, like they're here to just like devour and then leave again?
I don't know, that's a hard question, because you see how organized and intelligent they are. Everything is purely efficient.
Yeah, and it's kind of unanswerable. Like, we'll never know, but like that's kind of how I almost read it. Is like, yes, they're way more advanced than us, but for whatever reason, their world died too. Like they had to leave to and find ways to consume outside of their natural habitat. And is that better? Is all of this like consumption? And that's part of the theme of the movie, right? It's like this is a very anti-capitalistic movie. But it was just interesting thoughts that I was having while I was watching this. Yeah. And so then, yeah, you were saying like how Nancy, when they regroup, is saying, you know, like we have to assimilate with them. We have to pretend that we have no emotions and everything. And they, you know, they're trying to do that. And that's when another one of just the weird off-putting things happens. Yeah. Is we see a human dog hybrid, like pod person hybrid, comes out, and it actually makes sense too, because we see, like, as they're walking around, we see the homeless people outside sleeping beside pods, and it just so happens that the banjo player who has the dog is sleeping beside his dog, and there's a pod there, and it just so happens that like the pod accidentally has bred them. And there's even a point, now that I'm thinking about it, early on in the film, and this is like in the opening act of the film, where Elizabeth is explaining how plants can like crossbreed and how like this plant might be a crossbreed. So, you know, again, like all of this stuff that kind of fits in like retroactively and makes sense. It kind of reminded me of Annihilation in that moment a little bit. Like obviously Annihilation with the bear is like very special and very unique in and of itself, but like the dog with the face is absolutely kind of terrifying, especially, you know, if you're Elizabeth and you see that, like that would definitely take me out of things. Like I would definitely have lost my mind there. Yeah, because they're trying to assimilate and walk around as they've learned from Nancy, and then this happens and you're like, and then that catches, like, all of the pod people see them and they're like, oh, those people aren't actually assimilated. Yeah, exactly. And Nancy masks it still. She like doesn't react to it and stays in the pod people group. I thought she screamed a little bit and then they started looking around and like, but the dog kind of No, I rewatched it. I rewatched it this morning, and she like looks at it and like kind of like makes a small face and then goes right back to what she's doing. And so she actually stays there while Matthew and Elizabeth run away at that point, because Elizabeth starts freaking out and Matthew has to go with her. Yeah, Nancy does. Yeah, yes, okay. Yeah. Really, really, so many like tiny details like that are just so perfect. And then so they run, and where they end up is in the harbor area of San Francisco. It's like the old industrial area where all of the big freight ships come in, and there's this like factory that they find where all of the pods, like the quick pods, are being bred like in this big warehouse, and it's like a whole big operation. And you're like, at that point I'm like, It's over. Like there's no going back. How do they stop this, right?
Yeah.
And Matthew still has hope at this point, right? Whereas Elizabeth like has more or less given up. Like she has given up hope.
She's so tired.
Yeah, well, and I guess we didn't say this at all, but like they shot themselves up full of speed, and whereas Kibner, when Kibner caught them in the health department, he actually put some sedatives into them.
Yeah, and like at that point, I was like, he said, "I'm giving you a mild sedative. You won't care about any of this in an hour." And then I was like, "Oh, but they just took the speed. How much is it going to counteract? Like how long?" Yeah.
And so. Like and so then they go and see like the factory and everything, and they hear the ship and they hear the music, and that's where Matthew is like, I need to go, and I think this might be our answer. This might be help.
Yeah.
And like Elizabeth is so given up, like at this point, like she's just completely like given up. She's depressed. She's given up on life, basically.
They said, "I love you," finally.
Yeah. There's all of that, and so he goes and he realizes at the ship. And Amazing Grace is playing, but it's like we realize that actually the ship is there to transport all of the pods worldwide.
Yeah.
And at that point, you're like, who is stopping this? Nobody is stopping this because this is it's over. It's literally over at this point. Like that's where I give up hope too.
Yeah.
And so then Matthew goes back and he finds that she's fallen asleep and he tries to wake her up. And this is the second like scariest part of the whole movie, right?
Yeah.
Is we finally see the transformation happen like to its end point.
And like I'm so glad we got to see that too, because like leaving it vague wouldn't work. But seeing her face fall into itself and like get pulled by like it's like the moss stuff from inside, like just like
the husk. Yeah, it just leaves like coconut husk, basically.
Yeah, and then that finally, like, my first question in the movie, one of my first questions was, what is all that stuff in the back of that garbage truck? And then they answer it fully and, like, conclusively so well. It was disgusting.
It was really gross and scary, and then she pops up naked behind him, and pure unadulterated horror at the fact that, like, the person that he loves has given up and died, and now this pod person who like is her but also isn't her is coming after him and trying to convince him.
Yeah, and also because they're the work spouse, like he's wanted her for a long time, and now she's naked in front of him. I thought he was just gonna fall, like he was just gonna give up and be like if this is the only way I get to be with you, then so be it.
Right. And so, he, in rage, he, like, completely destroys the facility, which is awesome. It's a really cool scene, and, like, he's fighting all of them, and she's in there, like, still, like, naked, screaming at him and everything. Yeah. And he somehow gets away. Then we get to the closer of the film, where we see him, and he's walking around, like, observing everything, like he's observing the children being all sent to become pod people, and he like just observes like silently this world and what's become, basically.
Yeah, and you don't really see any kids except for the very beginning and the very end, and like that again just drives home the hopelessness.
Yeah, exactly. He even goes into work and he observes Elizabeth working and everybody in the office together. Do you think at this point he's a pod person or he's still Matthew?
I think at that point he was still Matthew.
I think so too. And that actually makes the ending of this movie hit even harder, because I think that after seeing everything happening and the absolute hopelessness and despair setting in, and then watching Elizabeth just working there, I think he just gives up. I think that's literally what happens.
I think like during that time of him walking around, he's so emotionless because everything's been ripped away anyway, so he's just observing. Yeah. Like he's lost all of his humanity already. Yeah. He goes back, observes, and then gives up. And then but we don't see that in the movie.
No.
Which is amazing.
It's so well done. It's so bleak and so like I'll take it away from you. It is perfect. It is so perfect how it happens. Mm-hmm. And then the film closes, and this is like, oh.
See, I think like the film, when you see him cutting the news clippings again, because that's his first scene. It's also like the beginning of the very last scene. And you're still like, he's just going through the motions of his regular life. He normally comes into work and is clipping papers, that day's papers, like the notes that he wants to keep. Then you see him fall into the line of people walking down the hallway so perfectly. I was like, he's really assimilated, like he's faking it. And then he's just walking and walking, and like the way, like where is he going? Because I don't think he would have to go to, what was it, like the Parliament building or like the town hall or something like that.
Yeah.
And then Nancy shows back up again.
Yeah, and he's just walking like into that Parliament building. Amazing Grace is playing, like really twisted and dark.
Yeah.
And she's like, "Oh, like Matthew, like I can't believe we made it out together."
Yeah.
And you still think at this point that it's really Matthew.
Yeah.
And then he looks at her and
raises his arm.
Yeah, and the like pod person scream comes out, and that's how this movie ends. And literally with her crying, and it zooms into his face when she realizes that she's the only one left. It zooms into his face, and then it cuts to black, and the credits roll silently. And I was like, sitting there, like jaw on the floor, like I can't believe that's how this movie just ended. That's amazing.
Yeah. Like imagine being in the theater to watch this.
Oh my God. I would have sat in the theater in the dark, in the quiet for probably like 5 minutes afterwards. Like, I that's basically how I sat after watching this movie. It's such a bleak ending that fits so well with the entire movie. Like, it's almost, and we're starting to get into effects and filming now here, but that actually wasn't the intended way that they were going to end this movie. Like, you know, Hollywood likes to have a Hollywood ending to film. Like, you don't like to have films that, or have a lot of films that like end really dark, because you want the audience to be really happy. Like, you know, like go to this imaginary world, and you want the heroes to be victorious kind of thing. And so I think the original ending is like, or she finds Matthew, and then they kind of look at each other and like kind of give each other a nod that they're like still kind of legit and surviving. And then last minute, they just decided to switch it to this. And part of it was because they kind of discussed it together. It was the director and then the screenwriter and I think the producer, like the night before, were like, what if we made this ending a lot darker? So I think Donald Sutherland was the only actor even on set who knew about that. Like, I don't think that Nancy's actor knew that he was going to do that to her. Like, I really don't think that that anybody was aware or anybody had any idea that was going to happen. If
they pulled that off, that's amazing. I would love to like confirm that. But yeah, that's absolutely awesome.
They actually didn't even film the original intended shot of like them getting away together, that little bit of hope, because they didn't want the studio to like veto it and like take the other shot instead. So it's really, really important to the film. I think that it's what makes this film like even more impactful is the way that it ends, that Matthew just gives up hope basically.
Yeah.
And it decides to assimilate. And so I'm so happy that they did it. Like they didn't even know, like the studio executives didn't even know that's how it was going to end, because they thought the script was going to end like that with the little glimmer of hope, until they got to see like the cut. They actually screened it together in George Lucas's house. Is when everybody found out how it was going to end. Yeah,
man, that's awesome, because this would not have been a cult classic if not for that.
Yeah. That's part of what makes it so great, is the original ending.
Yeah, I'm so glad they got it right. Like, how many other movies with great concepts didn't get the ending right? And like, I bet, I haven't looked at it, but there are multiple versions of Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Correct.
Like, this was a remake, and it's based off a book. So, I want to know, like, I've heard that this is the best of all of them, basically, but also the best ending.
So it is considered, we'll talk sequels, prequels, and reboots right now. So the original Body Snatchers, it's called The Body Snatchers, a novel from 1955 by Jack Finney. Yeah, the big difference is, I think, in the end, I think that the aliens themselves can only live for about 5 years, and then they all die. So basically, like, they live for 5 years, they consume everything that they can, and then they move on to the next world.
Okay.
So I think the way that it ends is they basically convince the aliens to leave Earth, like that that the freedom fighters essentially aren't going to like let them go, and so there's more resistance than they're used to, and they end up leaving. So like there's, you know, positive ending there. And then shortly after the book comes out, Invasion of the Body Snatchers is the original adaptation from 1956, and I'm pretty sure even in that movie it ends with Benel kind of saving the day and living, you know, the FBI kind of swooping in and saving them, because it's a small town setting. It's not like San Francisco. So they changed it to like a setting which can be more easily quarantined. And again, actually, that's part of the reason why this film was able to have such a bleak ending, is because the director, like we mentioned, the director of the original has a cameo in this. He's the taxi driver. He, like, they discussed with him, like, what's your biggest regret of the original film? And he was like, I didn't want that ending. I wanted a darker ending to this. I thought this deserved a darker ending. And that's when they decided to switch it.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
That's where like good collaboration between like the people who really understand the material is so important.
Well, and this is even kind of, you could even consider this, and it technically in canon is not, but you could, if you want, consider this as a sequel to the 1956 film, because the 1956 film takes place in that small town, and it's the same like actor, Kevin McCarthy, appears in this one. And so there's been people who have like connected the two and said, you know, you can think of it as like Kevin McCarthy is aware that this is taking place and it happened in his small town and now it's growing. And so he's running around to different cities trying to convince people to like, you know, that something's happening basically.
Yeah.
And so we're taking place like in a continuation of that story, which is, it's a cool idea. I think that it makes the films interconnected and that you have to watch the first one. But like you said, this is considered, if not the greatest, one of the greatest remakes of all time. And it's so well done. It's so special to me that like I will definitely watch the 1956 version at some point. But to me, like this feels so definitively like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, like the Invasion of the Body Snatchers, even after just this first watch.
Yeah.
So, like, I'm never going to see the 1956 version the same way.
Exactly.
Same way, I don't think.
So when I was watching, I was considering that it seems like the way that San Francisco got so covered by this was it has to do with the rain. So wherever it rains a lot, then the spores can actually like become alive in the rain and then go down, merge with the plants, and then start infecting people. So I was like, it can't, like, it's not raining all over the world. So obviously, like, there is still some hope somewhere else in the world that they'll sort through this. But again, we don't know the exact timeline, but the speed with which they replicate, especially once they have those quick pods, it's crazy.
Well, again, it's exponential too, right? Like the time that it takes to go from like one person to 1,000 people, it's like, it's going to be, you know, that might take a month or something. But after that, like, you know, you're going to double every day, basically. Like the whole city's going to be gone in like, every night. So like the whole city's gone in like, you know, 2 months. Like that's all it takes in this or less. And you're not going to notice it when there's 1,000 people out there. You're going to notice it when there's 30 to 50% of the population suddenly is sick.
Yeah.
And even like, again, this day and age with like COVID, like, you know, there's interesting comparisons between the two there. Like, oh, this movie just holds up because its ideas and themes are just like so timeless. That it's really fascinating. Like there's very few movies that hold up in the way that this one does. Yeah,
and what I found cool too was almost every, let's say, decade that one of these movies comes out, it's tied with a global or like at least American local phenomenon. Like the first one was like the Red Scare, and then this one came out right after Watergate, and like
it's connected to that. It's also, you know, like the decade after Vietnam as well, like very important to American culture.
And there's so many crazy things happening today, and like people even today are like, they think of other people sometimes as like NPCs in a video game. So like it's almost like that, like we can see the connection no matter where or when you're watching this. Like you can see the connection. It's
apathy towards like environmentalism. Like there's so much going on with this movie. thinking about this as well, and I want to come back to sequels, prequels, and reboots right after this like thought process, but I was thinking about this movie, and there's obviously like the ever-present connection to capitalism, and capitalism, even like as it's changed and adapted over since 1978, like this movie still really hits home at like, you know, the negatives of capitalism and assimilation, conformity, all of that sort of thing. Like, I thought that this movie, as somebody who's like just entering their 30s, I think there's no better time to watch a movie like this than in your 30s, because, you know, your 20s are like that time of a little bit of rebellion and like learning about yourself and who you are, and like
pure
trying to find your place in this world. Yeah, pure hopefulness. And then the 30s are I feel like are such a weird time period in your life, right? Where you're starting to like get into your job, and like, you know, like you're starting to see what the rest of your life is kind of looking like.
And you understand like the world much more. Like you understand how interconnected everything is. All of the things happening in the world affect your economy, and then that affects the people around you. And like we're seeing all of these ideas with social media, like just everywhere, and like the information and misinformation, disinformation, like all of those things.
Right.
Yeah.
For me, this hit like especially hard. Like it just felt, you know, again, like you're kind of settling in, and you're kind of like looking at everything, and you're like, do I want to be a part of this machine? Like I felt really like particularly connected to Matthew and Elizabeth's characters working at the health department there, and you know, seeing them, and there's actually a lot of discussion about this film and the themes of this film online, and part of those themes were like how it feels like Matthew and Elizabeth's characters were probably hippies in the 60s and have now, you know, like matured and assimilated now in their 30s. Yeah, and assimilated into this. And and so like that I thought that was all really fascinating, and such a really cool exploration of that idea. And where you fit, and like, are you just another cog in the machine, basically?
Yeah.
So all of that was really interesting. But going back to sequels, prequels, reboots, and talking about like the original movie and the book, like the books actually has really mixed reception when it comes out, and then like each iteration since has kind of like changed and explored like deeper ideas of it, like and even in the 1956 movie, like there was big plot holes and issues with the idea of it, and this movie kind of explores all of that deeper, and it fixes like all of the issues that the previous adaptations have had at this point in time. There are kind of some other remakes of this, like you said, like one comes out almost like every decade, it feels like.
Yeah, it's slowed down a bit recently.
Yeah, it has. Like there was a third version in 1993 called Body Snatchers, fourth one 2007 called The Invasion, and then there's actually like some other loosely connected films, like The Faculty from 1998 is actually like very loosely based on Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and that's actually one of Jess's like cult classic favorite movies. So I'm gonna have to rewatch that one again after having watched this one, because I think that's gonna be put things into perspective a little bit.
Yeah.
And then there's a 2019 movie called Assimilate. I don't think a lot of people saw it, but that's also a film that very much is connected and part of the DNA of Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Effects and filming. So a few things that I want to talk about with the effects and filming of this one. You know, you and I have already kind of talked a little bit about some of the way that this film is framed, and you know, the cinematography and how we both really loved it. Like the camera really does feel like another character almost in this. Yeah.
It goes back to a few movies that we've watched, like Harikiri.
Yep. You didn't watch Cape Fear with me, did you?
No, I didn't.
Honestly, it kind of feels similar to Cape Fear in the way that it's shot. Like it's almost like they're using like old style camera techniques, right?
Yeah,
I always love to see that in modern movies. They actually like, and that's actually something that they were kind of going for, is they wanted to keep some of the film noir aspects of the original adaptation, and I think they did that very well.
Yeah, like the use of the camera was so good at adding to that, like the whole feeling of the movie.
Yeah.
Like when he is going up the stairs in her house to grab her while she's asleep and like being doubled, like that whole scene, like the use of the camera was so good. Just the different angles
And yeah, the use of the lighting and everything, and him breaking into like her house, and like I freeze framed it because I was just taking a break, go to the washroom or something, and like when I freeze frame it, he's like got his like hand into the door to like unlock the door and everything, and that like it's a really cool shot as well. Like something that I noticed. Really appreciated all of that. Other just like fun little neat stuff. Donald Sutherland had to like, they wanted him to have that weird curly hairstyle, and so basically like he had to get permed like every single day, like in the pink rollers. So if you can picture like the pink rollers, yeah that he was doing that. He actually got hit by a car while he was filming. So he got hit by a Volkswagen Beetle, and so the driver who hit him was like, "Oh my god, not you!" Like he was afraid he was gonna lose his job or something. Yeah. So we talked about the director of the original Invasion of the Body Snatchers. He plays a taxi driver. He actually drove them around the city of San Francisco. Like that was like actually them in the car driving around, which is, you don't see that very often in movies because of like the insurance fears. And funny enough, like this is one where they probably shouldn't have done that, because Don Siegel basically couldn't see. Like I think he was like borderline legally blind at this point. Donald Sutherland and Brooke Adams in the back are like actually afraid because he can't drive, or he shouldn't be able to drive. And like they looked so nervous, and like at that point in the movie it made sense too. So like that's an awesome little tidbit, that like that was one of those real moments, because like he's looking in the mirrors, they look in the mirrors, they look like where he's looking, and they're like, what is he seeing right now? Or what isn't he seeing? And for different reasons than we think on initial viewing. I love this little detail. They asked Kevin McCarthy to come back and film this film. While they were preparing to shoot his scene, there was a naked homeless man that actually recognized him. And he was like, "Oh, well, like, what are you guys filming? I remember you from Invasion of the Body Snatchers." And he was like, "Oh, I happen to be filming like the reboot of this film." And the naked homeless guy was like, the first one was better. And so like that was the joke on set, was like they got their first review of the film like before they'd finished filming it.
That's awesome.
Donald Sutherland actually decided he wanted to do his own stunts, and there's not a lot of like stunts in the film, but like in the end when he's like destroying the factory, like he actually filmed that himself, destroying everything. There was no harness on him, like if he fell, he fell kind of deal. When the factory kind of explodes, he barely gets out of the way in time. Wow. There was actually an extra that got like really seriously injured from that, because he missed the cue to get out of there basically. Oh no. So yeah, really wild.
I just saw something the night after the movie's release. Someone put the pods around Los Angeles and like freaked the hell out of people.
It's such good advertising for the film, right? It's so off-setting or like off-putting.
It so works for this movie in particular, because it's such a callback, or like it has the same DNA as the old radio stories that they used to put out. And then like the War of the Worlds are...
War of the Worlds is the key one.
Yeah, and like people were like calling the police and stuff. So that's so cool they did that.
That's actually a point that the director Philip Kaufman actually made, is that like he said that the 1956 film was like really good radio from like the previous generation, right? And this does connect. It's similar to Cape Fear, where it feels really grounded in like the old style of filmmaking that we don't see as much anymore, but is still like just as phenomenal to watch as it did back then, right? Like if you don't watch old movies, you really do miss out on some of these techniques that are just so exciting to watch.
Oh, I kept seeing the Transamerica Pyramid in San Francisco. I had no idea that was a real building, but that was like heavily, like anybody I guess from that time would have known like, oh, this is San Francisco. I had no idea that it was San Francisco. I had to look up that building, the like weird pyramid tall building. Right. So yeah.
Oh, this is something that I didn't know if I noticed consciously, but it's something that's actually really interesting framing wise. Again, going to the camera, is often the way that everything's shot is the character is looking through like frosted kind of glass, and how that kind of distorts your view. It's something that of an old film technique to kind of emphasize like where symbolism and metaphors are, and also trying to portray that like things aren't what they seem kind of deal. So it's just all of that little like subtle film cinematography that's really cool.
Yeah, and like it's awesome to see when people like everything just worked for the timing of this movie to allow the people involved to do it right. Yeah. Like they connected everything. Like there's so many details, and like it's like no expense was spared. At least like no creative thought was spared.
This is one of those movies that it's in and of itself, it's a remake, but it's considered one of the best remakes of all time. But you don't need to ever remake this because it's so perfectly encapsulates like everything. Like you said, the only reason why you would ever want to remake it is if you wanted to maybe change the themes of the movie to fit like the modern viewing. But it just even now, like we were saying, your viewing experience in your particular point in life is you're going to draw your own conclusions and interpretations of the film, which is really cool. Score of the movie. So this was sound edited by Ben Burt, who was actually one of the most influential people on the set of the original Star Wars, which had come out the year before. He actually created a lot of like the original sounds and ambience from Star Wars. So it's really cool that connection is there. It's probably why George Lucas also got like that express cut viewing early on. They were conscious of like, we want the nature and like everything from like what you would hear in a city to like really come through early on in the film. And then eventually as things go on, like we really just want to hear the industrial parts, like the garbage trucks and stuff like that, and kind of make things quiet and unsettling at that in that point of view.
Like life got quiet because like it had changed, and then it was just the mechanics of an efficient species in a city. Yeah, crazy.
Yeah. And the pod growing scene, so that what they were using for sounds for that were a heartbeat from an ultrasound from his pregnant wife. The pod screamers are pig squeals. They mixed a bunch of other sounds in as well. Like, it's a very unique sound. And again, I would relate it back to The Thing and how the things scream one particular moment in time in that film. It's so memorable. Like, good audio quality, good like sound effects can really sell a movie.
Yeah, and they nailed it. It's I wish I could be a Foley artist just to create those sounds. Like they're my favorite thing in almost all of these types of movies.
Yeah. And I fully agree. Like,
and like the heartbeat was so harrowing, like just and like suspenseful.
Yeah. Yeah. Fully agree. Like it's really the unsung hero of some of the greatest movies of all time. Like, you think about it a little bit when you think about Jaws or something like that, but a great score can really make or break a film like this.
All the right pieces came together for this movie.
I agree. Legacy, so obviously pod people. It's literally the zeitgeist of pod people. Like, maybe, the last 10 years, that idea has kind of gotten a little bit quieter, but growing up, it was something that I was fully aware of, like the idea of pod people.
Yeah, and the pod people scream at the end, like that has been replicated in like all of our favorite like comedy cartoons, like adult cartoons. It's been in like almost everything. It's been referenced so many times, and like I'm glad I finally got to see it. It's very similar to Soylent Green for that aspect.
Yeah, a little bit. Some aspects of it I definitely thought about Soylent Green. It crossed my mind as I watched it, like especially the factory settings as well. And what's really interesting about this is when it first came out, like, and this is something that we've maybe seen with a lot of the great sci-fi or horror movies that we've talked about, is initial responses to movies like this can always be, or are often seem to be very either mixed or even sometimes negative. Like, this was a pretty like controversial movie at the time, and part of it was its status as a remake because the first one was considered to be a cult movie, like very well done and everything. A lot of people were kind of put off by that, a lot of critics. There are people who are put off by the filmmaking style, maybe like some of the pacing even people had issue which is kind of interesting.
Also, like, would it be considered a PG movie today?
I don't think so. No, there's nudity in it. Like
exactly, but this
it's definitely an R-rated movie still.
I think it came out as PG something.
I don't know. This is definitely an R-rated movie. Oh, it is PG for 1978.
Yeah.
What?
Exactly, yeah.
That's wild.
I guess it's not like overt nudity. Like you see her twice and like it's not central. It's just, and she's kind of behind bushes. I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's 13 plus in Canada, 14A Ontario here. So yeah, but it's PG in the US.
Yeah.
So that's wild. I didn't notice that at all. I don't think at that time it should have been PG, but whatever. So that also maybe had an impact on the rating. But yeah, over time, she's grown to become known as like one of the greatest sci-fi horrors of all time. I need to rewatch this again, and I'm really excited to rewatch this again. And first viewing, like this really feels like an important movie. I'm really, really glad that we watched this one.
I agree. I wish I convinced Annabelle, like I tried a little bit harder to convince her to watch it, because the pacing was right for her to watch like an older movie like this. And I think she actually would have really enjoyed it. And yeah, I enjoyed the hell out of it.
Yeah. So yeah, let's talk personal reviews. So Jess didn't really watch this one with me either. She kind of watched it. She was paying attention to other stuff, but then she kind of got a little bit more into this movie than I was expecting as we were watching it. But yeah, for me, like this is an important horror movie for me, sci-fi horror. This definitely goes into my top 10 list, like of sci-fi horror. I think that I'm gonna have to rewatch it a few more times, but it's up there with The Thing on the first viewing. Like it was really, really good.
I agree. For me, it's like I don't like a lot of horror. I'll watch some of it, but this is like the only type of horror that I'll watch is sci-fi horror, really. It's way up there. It's better than not
I'm going to say that I think I like this better than the original Alien.
I was just going to say that. Like I was like, is it better than Alien? And I think it is.
You know, Aliens is an action horror. It's a little bit different, like an action sci-fi horror, so it's a little bit of a different movie, and I don't think you're comparing apples to apples here, but the original Alien is a bit of a slow burner sci-fi horror. It's really good. Like, don't get me wrong, the original Alien movie is in my top 100 movies of all time, but this one might be higher. I really, really liked this movie a lot.
It's so smart and subtle. Like that's what elevates it for me, is like it's not for, there's no like actiony macho stuff. There's like, it's just so psychological.
It just comes down to like there was a passionate director who really loved the source material and wanted to like elevate it, and it seems like everybody who was involved in the project was just, again, like very passionate about what they were doing, and it really transpires through like all of these small details that we're talking about, like how, you notice the garbage trucks later, or you notice the garbage trucks, but you don't really understand how that all connects. And then later, like they show you why that's important to everything. They don't tell you. They never go outright and say, oh, the dump trucks must be collecting all the bodies. That's just something that you have to infer. And that kind of like lack of hand-holding is something that, as you and I, as big moviegoers, and even like, consumers of other types of media, like reading books and all that sort of stuff, that's something that you and I can really appreciate.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
I would expect to see this movie in my top 5 list at the end of the year. That's how much I like this movie. Like I will say one step higher. I loved this movie. Like this is so much a Blake movie. Like if you're into The Thing, if you're into like horror, if you're into like horror sci-fi, like Alien, like this is much watch material. This is like, if you're into Stephen King, like anything like of those vibes, like if horror or sci-fi are in your sphere of interest, you need to see this.
Yeah, like the age of it shouldn't detract from the quality. Like if you love this genre, definitely it's up there. Like you have to watch it. It's definitely a must watch.
Yeah.
I didn't add anything to what you said, but I'm losing it.
It's okay. Again, this is incredible. Like everything comes together really well, and I'm so happy. Like this is the perfect movie for somebody who's seen a lot of movies. When you asked me the question of like what's something that's been on your list that you've heard about but never seen, like this was so perfect for that.
Yeah. And like that's what I love about doing this podcast, is finding those like there's so many reasons to watch like all these other ones that we want to watch, and we end up watching all this like newer media and things like that. But when you go back, you have a list of like, oh, I've heard so many things and I've seen so many references about this one thing. I would love to understand it fully. This like embodies that whole reason. This, like, that's why I do this podcast. I think like I want to understand more about where all of our good media comes from, and it's from things like this.
It takes a little bit of time to get into something like this, you know, like you and I have been passionate about movies for a long time. And you know, we've watched all of the like top 250 movies, we've seen The Thing, we've seen Alien and everything else, and Invasion of the Body Snatchers is only like a 7.4 on Rotten Tomatoes, so it's not something that's gonna like immediately that you're going to think of when you think of like a good sci-fi horror. But and again, it just sometimes it comes down to like certain genres are not going to connect with a certain portion of the population, and therefore just going to have a lower rating, like because a lower percentage of people are going to inherently connect with it, and there's nothing, you know, you could do about that. But if this is something along the lines of something that you already enjoy, like, oh my god, this is incredible. I was speechless when I finished this movie and sat there. I let the credits roll like in silence and just thought about this movie.
Do you have any detractors, things you caught that you were like, why'd they do that, or like this type of acting I didn't like, or anything like that?
So the only two criticisms that I had, and I'll say had, was the first one being Dr. Kibner, and I felt like, you know, the psychiatrist aspect, and then like slowly dawning on me that he might be a pod person kind of thing. That was a really cool like series of thought process that it took me to get there, and even like the paranoia of that setting in. The only criticism that I'll give this movie, to say that it's not perfect, is that the pacing is great. However, I think that they probably could have cut 5 minutes of running around near the end, to the third act. I thought that might have been just a little bit overdone, although for what they were showing you, it's just like, again, it's just more like thoughts about this world to live in your head rent free. Like when they go to the airport and they're basically like pulling people out of their cars who they think are humans, and like this whole system already developed to like, you know, keep people from getting out, like keep this all contained. And
they know that they are gonna try and get out, and where are they gonna go? To the airport. Yeah.
So it's like little details like that where it's like, oh, you know, like maybe you didn't need that, but at the same time, like it's something that just like, you know, a week from now, something like that might pop in my head, and I'll be like, oh yeah, like I guess that they did that, and that kind of explains this part of this world kind of in a way, and just how in control of it the aliens were already.
The control was so important. One acting detractor from this movie, or criticism I have, is it's 1978, and the women are like when they're scared, they're like shaking their head, screaming like over the top. It's overacted, but that was the time. That's all I can say about that.
I would agree with you. Yeah, there's definitely like I'm picturing Nancy's like fear at the end. Like it was maybe a little bit over the top.
It was cheesy and campy.
Yeah, and you kind of said the opposite like earlier, where like you thought that the women characters were written actually relatively well. Like Nancy's character was written in a way that like, you know, she was on board, like she was intelligent and like perceptive of what was happening. But I would agree with you that yeah, there is a little bit of overacting, and that's just part of like what the expectation for was at that period of time.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not a huge criticism at all. Like it's hard to find criticisms. Other than that, it's just like a little bit of logic of like, why are they getting in a cab? Like, steal a car. Like it's so easy. Like I don't understand why they were like
I think it's just like those like small little trust things that you still have, right? Like there's still this like belief in humanity at this point. Like they really, really still don't understand just the gravity of the situation that they're in and how many people are already infected at this point.
I can skip over that. I could suspend my disbelief, but like there were times when I was like why aren't they going, like why are they following society's rules still, right, and getting screwed by it?
I think it's just, again, it comes back to like the safety of safety in numbers kind of idea, right? Like the safety of conforming, and if I conform, then they can't get me kind of thing, right?
See, yeah, that's where I think Jeff Goldblum's character could have been a little bit more, could have been utilized better. Like he was an outside the box thinker. He thought about everything. He should have been a little bit like, they should have relied on him to be like, no, we're gonna go off script here. We're not like, we're going rogue. We're doing something awesome to like get away. I think they could have utilized him a little bit better, because he is that character. Like he's that actor to be that guy. Like,
but this was so early on in his career. Yeah, that, they didn't know that at that point too.
Exactly,
right?
And that comes in for sure. But
that's like, also just part of the gold of this movie. It's like young Jeff Goldblum, like such a young Jeff Goldblum. He was like, what? He said he was like 6 foot or 6'1" at this point.
6'4",
he was like 170 pounds. Yeah, 6'4", 170 pounds. It's like, oh, Jeff Goldblum, you still have so much growing left.
Yeah.
My young child.
Yeah, he didn't like. He had the essence of his acting, and his characteristics are there, but he hasn't leaned into them yet in his career. One other like really cool thing that I liked was there's like a small sequence where all they're doing really is filming from the waist down, like people's feet, how they're walking. Yeah, Elizabeth and Matthew are walking through the city. It's like 3/4 through the film, and they're just filming the pod people, just their feet, like turning and following, and like connecting and following. Like the hive mind has connected and they're following, and like that was another thing where the camera work was so well done.
Yeah, agreed. All right, I think we should probably wrap this up. We've talked for quite a bit, so this was a fantastic movie. I expect it, like I said, for me to talk about it more at the end of our year wrap up, because I really loved this one. I thought it was really special, and it absolutely just, it demands your time.
Of course, yeah, absolutely. I'll be convincing people to watch this for sure down the road.
Yeah, definitely. All right, I think that's it. We actually have to discuss separately what we're doing next, because I haven't even really looked at the list yet. So I will, as always, say if you have any recommendations for future movies to watch in November, usually that's kind of historically biography month, or war movies, westerns, all that sort of stuff, like anything of interest there. I've kind of got in the back of my mind one movie that I might want to do this year, but yeah, throw out a recommendation, and as always, tell your dad.
And your mom.
Yeah, we won't discriminate.
Yeah. And your mom's hot.
All right. On that note, we'll see you next time.
All right. Bye.
Bye.